Chris, first of all, welcome. Thank you for doing this. What will happen is people will be able to ask questions through the chat. I'll relay those as they come in as appropriate, but otherwise you and I will chat. You know, I've had the pleasure of talking with Alan Savory. I've talked with Bobby Gill, who you probably, I assume you know both those guys from the Savory Institute, and I was happy to see when you popped up on the schedule because I think what you guys do is just tremendous work. I don't want to, let me let you kind of sort of introduce yourself a little bit and talk about who you are, what you do, what your background is, and then I'm sure we can develop a conversation. It'll be quite interesting. So if you don't mind, Chris, again, thanks for being here. And just so you know where you're at, you're in a community of people who are very appreciative for what people like you do that help produce our food and help get the food to us. And we are, particularly when it comes to meat, we're all dedicated meat eaters, and some of us, that's all we eat. Some of us only eat meat. In fact, the majority of us, that's what we do. So we are, just with having said that, you're in a very friendly audience, I think. So go ahead, Chris, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, I'm Chris Kerston with the Savory Institute to give a little bit of a kind of high level overview of what we do. And I know you guys have had some of these conversations before, but I'll give the brief version and we can dive in as much as you want. But Alan Savory developed a process to honor some core principles in nature to mimic how predators, grazers, and grasslands have developed together to create synergies. And in that, in terms of kind of an operational tool, he developed a triple bottom line proactive planning process. Triple bottom line is where you address the social, the environmental, and economic together. And so you treat that as kind of an unhingeable or unbreakable molecule. And he was really one of the first people to talk about that. That's a big buzzword in finance now, but 40, 50 years ago, he started talking about that in the 60s. That was kind of a new concept. But it was this notion that in a holistic sense, we really can't divide ourselves from the land. We can't divide ourselves from our families and our communities. We can't divide ourselves from our financial and economic constructs. And so all of that has to come together and be acknowledged at one. So the way I'll often describe that is, most livestock producers will kind of walk out in their field and go, okay, do I have more feed for the animals today or not enough? Should I move them right away or do I have a couple of days? And that's a little bit like a business running with the cash in their pocket. So if you operated entirely on cash flow, didn't know where you were going to be coming up and why, that's pretty much how most producers manage their grass. And so what we bring to the table is a budgeting process that you should know where your animals are going to be 3 months from now and the reasons why. And it just like a budget, all models are wrong. Some are useful, that old cliche. Just like a budget, they're never right, but they provide you that North Star that shows you, okay, if this was my goals, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. When something goes out of whack, what can I do to kind of pivot everything else to get back on track? That's the core basis of what we teach, because it mimics nature at its kind of core design, meta level elements. We get all these net positive benefits on the land. And so I lead a program that's called Land to Market. I've been with the Savory Institute for 7 years, and prior to that was a practitioner. And Land to Market is all about now making these connections, quantifying positive environmental benefits that happen from livestock production. Yes, they can happen, and I hope our conversation goes there. But quantifying those environmental benefits and now connecting them with the players in business that want to be able to find those suppliers, highlight them, tell that story, and engage with consumers that care. So that's the strategic business unit that I have been a part of. And then I've run the whole gamut of everything. Before that, I've run a number of cattle ranches. I live in Northern California. I'm actually in an RV today because I'm a survivor of the Paradise Fire that happened 2 years ago in November 2018. So my family of four has been living in 240 square feet, and we've been building an off-grid homestead here in the Sierra Nevada foothills. But I've lived in the Northern California area for a long time on the Sierra Nevada side, a couple hours north of Tahoe, 3 hours northeast of the Bay Area, and have farmed and ranched in this region for a long, few decades now, and developed really early direct-to-consumer relational marketing, kind of operations from the farm to the consumers that care. Got really early into Weston Price, and then later into paleo, and then now into keto. So I've been plugged in with those communities for a long time, and have been building those relationships between grower and eater around shared values for a very long time too.
Good stuff. And I think, from the other side, we as the eater side, we certainly are appreciating that. And as we learn more and more about this now, I do think the point you brought up, and I definitely want to talk about that, the verification of what we're doing or what you're doing, and what people within the Savory Institute and others like them that practice similar, whether you want to call it regenerative, holistic, adaptive, multi-paddock grazing, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of terms being thrown around, but the ultimate goal is to, build soil, build pasture, build biodiversity. I think, I chat with a guy named Alan Williams, who I'm probably sure you know who Alan Williams is. And, I thought he really did a really nice job of, sort of demonstrating this is what's happening. This is what we can show. This is what the current science shows, because a lot of sort of the naysayers, if people say, well, what Alan practices and preaches may work a few places, but it's not scalable. It's not sustainable. We don't have any good science to support that. But I think that is no longer the case. Can you talk a little bit to say in the last 5 years or so, what do we know about what can be done? And it's not just enough just to say you regenerate soil, because I think most ranchers are going to be like, well, I got to make money. And so talk about both those things, if you don't mind.
Yeah. And so that kind of scenario you just bring up is exactly what we have been pushing against for all of our history, that you just have this very core piece of human storytelling that livestock degrade landscapes, and they have to degrade landscapes, that there's something about taking an animal out of its native range and now managing it as a human, that somehow the inexplicable outcome of that is going to be inherent degradation. And I think in the modern world, you see that all too often. We know that feedlots are bad for the environment. We know that we've over industrialized these systems, that we're pushing all the externalities out, and those don't get accounted for, and it all becomes solely profit driven. Profit is key. Financial solvency is key in this. But we get way too many examples of the bad. And so you get these emerging case studies that say, oh, look at what's possible here. And the academic community, the press, the world at large points at that and goes, no, that's anecdotal. That's one little thing. That's an outlier. That doesn't really count. And we got kind of sick of that, to say the least. And so we about 6 or 7 years ago acknowledged an awakening that was happening on both sides, and kind of a perfect storm opportunity, if you will, to where producers were coming to us and saying, okay, we're healing our landscape. You can see it, you can feel it. It's really visceral when we take people out on the land, they know it. Many were part of university studies, but again, they were kind of one-off. And so they'd get kind of acknowledged as being anecdotal, even if we had good science behind it. And then at the same time, we had brands coming to us going, okay, you've trained tens of thousands of people around the world. How do we start engaging with that audience as a way to source and tell a better story and engage with our consumers on elevated values and shared values? And I'm a big believer that most world-changing innovation comes out of naivety. And we said, what if we scaled up a way to measure environmental impact, or the buzzword is ecosystem services? What if we measured environmental impact from livestock grazing at the farm level on farms all around the world using the same methodology, and told that story at the global scale with empirical science to back it up? And what we developed out of that, it took 6 years. We partnered with the Nature Conservancy and Texas A&M, and we actually have a really deep relationship with Michigan State University. There were some researchers from Australia and South Africa involved. And basically the task we set at hand is we said, we want to measure environmental health as a whole, and we need to do it in a way that we get real empirical outcomes, and we can deploy it to the poorest regions of the world and the most remote regions of the world, and then it was like, go. And so we had to find these kind of older methodologies in rangeland science that didn't require, a $1 million piece of equipment that could go and kind of capture these data points. And what we developed, we call ecological outcome verification. We're looking at soil organic matter. We're looking at sequestered carbon to be able to talk about that climate change piece. We're looking at soil water holding capacity and water infiltration rates. And we're looking at biodiversity at a number of different scales of microbes in the soil, plant life, and then wildlife. And so the three pillars really is soil, water, and wildlife. And so we've now deployed that method on over 2 million acres around the world in our first 18 months of kind of having it out of the barn and ready and taking it around the world. It's growing at an exponential rate, even in light of the pandemic. We'll have another 2 million acres that gets quantified this year. But part of our point of difference in this is we felt that we could scale up real outcomes measurement. And for those that don't know how this works most of the time, and where kind of most of the world is emerging, is equating practices with outcomes. And so, and Alan has fought, both Alans, Alan Savory and Alan Williams, have fought against this for most of their lives and their careers. But most of the time what you'll get is everybody tries to kind of distill down to the easy button. And so they'll say, oh, well, if you don't do any tillage, you get, 4 gold stars, whatever the hell a gold star means, and it's like, okay, we're just kind of assuming good things happened. And we said, this livestock thing is so darn politicized that we have to go out there with the best and most robust science. And we're going to quantify a bigger data set, and we're going to prove the case that yes, livestock can be a tool that can be managed poorly and make the land worse, but they can be used to mimic nature and they can make the land better. And we would actually say they're probably our best chance, civilization's best chance of solving climate change and some of our bigger global issues because of the nature of those ecosystems and the strong synergy between grasslands and grazers. Grasslands sequester more carbon than any other ecosystem on the planet. It is nature's check and balance to having too much atmospheric carbon is pull that down and put it in the soil. So that's what we're doing from a technical standpoint. And then we work with brands to source from those farms that are doing it best. And in that sourcing, now they can create products that really, for the first time in history, a consumer can pick up a product with full transparency and empowerment and know that that product made the land better as a result of how it was produced. And now we can all be empowered to send those right signals through the marketplace that this is what I want to be a part of. This is what I want to support. Whether you're buying direct from the farmer at the farmer's market or buying a box, beef or something like that, or you're shopping at Whole Foods or Kroger's or whatever it might be. So that's the goal, is to create new value streams for producers that they get honored for the good work that they do and incentivized to continue that journey and transparency, and to create a new food democracy for the end user, for the consumer.
I certainly applaud you in trying to make that a reality, because I certainly don't disagree with that. I think, obviously there is a huge push from the other direction to sort of, produce synthetic meat, to have plant-based meats, and when I talk about, when people think the answer is going to be, we're going to save the world by making meat in a lab. And, I'm like, well, where do you think the inputs come from? Where do you think the protein comes from? It comes from, largely degradative agricultural practices, monocrops, and so on and so forth. And people they have no clue. They just think it magically grows in the vats with no inputs. And so one of the things that we are trying to do, and I am, among that in this community, is just kind of demonstrating how actually healthy meat in general is for the human diet, because that's something that people also seem to think that it's bad for us. And so You know, we're trying to get a clinical study going. We're raising money for that right now. I have no doubt it'll happen, but I do think there's a benefit from producers, you know, to sort of, you know, maybe help get behind something like that would be really nice to show. Because I think obviously if we can demonstrate meat as a health food, then it makes that argument that you guys are showing even better, because there's other people out there say, well, who cares? Let's just get rid of meat and we'll just grow the fake plant burgers, and and they don't understand. You know, clearly they don't understand the environmental impacts of agriculture in general. The other thing, you know, is like people talk about grass finished meats, and you know, when I go and drive across whatever, and you see cows out in the field being pastured, I mean, they are still can be a degradative process, as you know. It has to be pastured a certain way, otherwise even grass finished beef can degrade the land, which is a common criticism. And some of the reports I've seen on, you know, that sort of these people that say, the naysayers say, no, you can't feed the world on a grass finished product because there's not enough land, it's degradative. That is assuming, I think, traditional grass feeding techniques. I think these studies are looking at, yeah, the cow farmer opens up field, says cow go to it. No real management. And I know that's a huge word for Alan. It's management. And so can you speak to this more directly, the scalability, the sustainability? How much land do we have? If we were to convert X number of ranches to a regenerative practice, at what point do we reach a tipping point? I know Alan mentioned to me, he said something like, if 30 to 40% of the ranchers in the U.S. would practice, you know, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, whatever you want to call it, holistic grazing, then we would offset pretty much all of the carbon emissions from every industry in the United States. Is that something that is realistic, or what do your numbers look like?
Yeah, no, I think you are spot on. That land use piece is such a critical part of this discussion and this debate. You know, somehow and for some reason, cropping has gotten a free pass on this. And I look at kind of the higher level, the aerial view, and I can relate with the part of vegetarians and vegans and even flexitarians that want to make radical decisions in their life to have an impact. I can relate with them on those pieces. The jump that they make to then cut livestock out of the system, I can't get there. I should say meat, because it could be wild meat. There are people that eat a sole diet of wild caught meat. Great, awesome. I can't get there. Every ecosystem on the planet has plants and animals working in tandem together. And it's only humans that divided that and then decided this one is good and this one is bad. If we look at the meta level, cropping systems, by definition, you are scraping away an existing ecosystem and you are micromanaging a new one and trying to use as much knowledge as we have to make that, the progressive ones are going to try to make that as functional as possible. But it is a new ecosystem that we have created, and we have displaced tremendous amounts of life in that process. To me, the beauty of ranching, and I still, in my 20 years of work on this now, have not figured out why people haven't come to the conclusion that animals are fitting into an existing ecosystem and enhancing it. And so, or I guess that's the progressive side, is enhancing it. But even at the lowest common denominator level, they are fitting into an existing functional ecosystem. And so there's some pieces there that you talked about of you know, the can we feed the world question that require some unpacking, because there's kind of some baked in assumptions that aren't really fair. Let's start first with the reporting piece. So there was a piece that came out from the UN, I think in like 2006 or 7, maybe even a little earlier than that, called Livestock's Long Shadow. And what was found in that is that the research would take manure from manure lagoons. So this is usually dairies. You know, the animals are pooping in, whether they're in a feedlot situation or in their milk parlor. They'll defecate in those facilities. That manure gets washed out into a lagoon while they're in those facilities. Some live their whole life in those cement buildings, some still graze, some, but it gets washed out in this lagoon. And now you've got all this cellulosic material in anaerobic conditions, and of course we're going to get lots of methane off of that. And so they would measure the methane off of these lagoons and go, oh, look how much a livestock system produces methane. And then they go, okay, well now if you're a grass-fed beef producer, it takes X number of days divided by this amount of methane. Okay, this is the methane impact of rangeland grass-fed beef. And it's ridiculous. And the scientists behind that eventually apologized, and everybody kind of called it out as bad science, but the damage was done. It was from the friggin' UN. Like, it had all the right monikers behind it. And so that piece was done. There's another piece kind of baked into that I think we as humans sometimes get to this place of, I don't know, kind of a conciliatory approach that we just can't believe there could be a world where we could have our cake and eat it too. When we look at nature and how nature functions, it creates abundance. Everything has a net positive benefit that it gives back to the system. And so if it didn't, it wouldn't still be here today. Everything has to be a positive contributor. And then we have this outside energy force of the sun that's kind of always feeding that. And so we're always getting abundance that comes back in. So this notion of kind of getting to, this word sustainable, I don't know, I'm a big fan of the word sustainable, because net zero is a human invention. And it's not the way the world works. You're either in downward spirals or upward spirals. And so this idea of, can we feed the world? I think sometimes we approach it the way that we look at cropping systems, that most of our conventional industrial cropping systems are supported by chemical inputs at this point. And so we've distilled everything to its lowest common denominator. It's really reductionist management. We take, what are the broad things that you see it in human nutrition too. What are the broad things that we think these species need? And then we kind of feed that to them, drip feed that to them. They don't have to do any of the work on their own, and build their own resilience. When you take those away, those support mechanisms away, your yields drop, because the whole system has gotten away from genetics and healthy soils, and just even the ability to be able to prop up life has been gone. We treat soil as a substrate to practice hydroponics. It really is a lot of how that works. And that might be nerdy if you're not deep into the agricultural world, but we're not really creating living systems. We're manufacturing them. The interesting thing about animal production is that when we take away all those externalities, a lot of times we can increase production. And it's totally the opposite of what we've thought or believed, because we've been kind of stewed in this notion that to do it right means that you get less yield. When you do it right in livestock, when you get the timing right, to your point, that we can go in and say, how do we maximize efficiency in this system? We can usually double a livestock farmer's production inside of the first 3 years, just by finding inefficiencies in grazing. If you think of each grazing as kind of a graze, or units of grazing days, we find they leave all sorts of resources behind through haphazard management. So going back to that budget discussion, if you kind of put a proper budget on that, you realize, I'm leaking cash all over the place, and you kind of get that dialed in, all of a sudden you find, okay, I can increase production on this land, not decrease it. Then as that ecosystem heals, and because it was part of a functional ecosystem to begin with, it's not as degraded, but it still has room for growth. As it heals and gets better and regenerates, then you can increase your production over that. So we've got ranchers out there that they're operating on, the upper echelons are at 4 or 5 time multipliers of what's possible for their neighbors. So if their neighbors, have got 100 cows per 100 acres, they're at 500 cows on 100 acres. So they're really pushing the boundaries of what we know is possible. So that feed the world one is challenging. It's hard to unpack that in a way that we can really push back in the debate, but that is the reality of the ecology. We're starting with more functional ecosystems. They're not drug addicts. And so we don't have to go through this rehab phase where we pull that addiction away, and we're going to see a slump in production for a longer period of time to rebuild those soils. And we're not operating in a monoculture, which isn't really going to allow that soil to rebuild anyway. That we're operating in a functional ecosystem, and we've kind of got all the parts and pieces to pick up and say, let's create abundance here. So that feed the world one, I see it as nothing more than a distracting challenge. And I think as we have more data come out around, again, that buzzword, the ecosystem services, the positive environmental benefits, we'll be coupling that with production data, and we'll be able to tell that story in a much more comprehensive way. But the challenge that's just been put in front of us because of these kind of baked in assumptions in society is you have to build a really robust case and a really large data set to get there. And we can do that, and we can do that while we're incentivizing the existing market structures that are in place. You also talked about these kind of faux products, whether it be, we work in textile and food, and so whether it be pineapple leather or mushroom leather or plastic synthetics, I find even more egregious. Or we're talking more the Impossible Burger and these fake meats. That's the best thing that's ever happened to our business and to our movement in some ways, because it's really galvanized the stakeholders at hand, that the more conventional players are saying, okay, if we don't change, we're going to lose market share. So we have to become more relevant. I really believe the next era of business is going to be about connecting the stakeholders on shared values. And so, brands that were more extractive in nature are now having to rethink their entire strategy and going, yeah, we're not going to give up our industry of being a meat producer, a meat provider, a leather company, but we're going to do it right. We're going to take it to the next level. And that industry is so much bigger than the impossible thing. So doesn't mean I'm not, that's kind of more of a short-term play. I still watch Impossible closely. I think it's total bullshit. And I'm glad people like you, Sean, are telling that story about how it's grown, and let's just use some common sense here and think about this at the broader level. But it's also driving a lot of change. And like in apparel, the number one thing we hear is we don't want to lose those mediums. I mean, leather is an amazing, incredible medium that can do all sorts of things from a functional engineering standpoint of the type of clothing and footwear they're trying to create. You can't beat that with pineapple leathers. They really don't want to get phased out of these ingredients and materials that they've kind of built their industry around. Like, I talked to McDonald's, I don't know, a year ago, and I'm not in any way supporting McDonald's, but it was interesting to me. They described themselves as a beef company before they described themselves as a hamburger company. They said, really, our last 100 years, and not that long, whatever, 70 years of innovation has been about how to work with the beef industry. And we just happen to make hamburgers. And they don't want to go down this impossible road. They want to figure out how to maintain relevancy in that beef space.
Yeah, and my understanding is McDonald's, maybe McDonald's Canada, perhaps has made some interest in sustainability and where their meat is coming from. So I think they are, at least, maybe shifting more that way, which I think would be a good thing. McDonald's, like I said, I think they have one ingredient in their restaurant that is worth eating, and the rest of it is largely junk. But yep. I mean, I think the beef, it's 100% beef. It's not cooked in seed oil like people tend to say. And I do think they are at least cognizant of the fact that sourcing is becoming more and more important to the consumer. So,
yeah, they've gone also fresh, never frozen, which allows us to create some local supply chains in island places and more remote regions where they can't get product there. And so we can start connecting them back with the farmers and create those relationships. They've also invested no less than $10 million into regenerative agriculture research and trying to understand what their next stage in that is. I think they could be a little bit more aggressive on that front, but they're the largest beef producer or beef buyer in the world. They're not gonna turn on a dime, but they're definitely at the table and trying to figure out how they're going to maintain their own relevance and be part of the solution.
Chris, let me ask you a little bit more, because, and I've talked to so many folks that are, kind of in your area, whether it be, Joel Salatin or Alan Williams or Fred Provenza or, Glenn Ellis. I mean, I've talked to so many regenerative guys, and I'm all in on that. I mean, I think it's 100% the way we need to go from the environmental impact. I think the health claims are being made need to be solidified. There's people out there saying, this beef is better than that beef. And I think the studies need to be done before you can make those claims, because I've got people that, they eat what they can afford, and whether it's from, Walmart beef that comes from a feedlot, or it's, the stuff from Joel's farm, they all get healthy regardless. And I think, so I think for people that are out there making these claims, I'd love to see some studies. I would be the first one to stand up and say, look, regenerative meat is better for human health, but the studies have not been done yet. And so until they are, I can't say that, and I'm not going to. But when it comes to the environmental side, 100%, I think we need to go that way. Talk to me a little bit more about profitability. And I know you didn't mention this, but I mean, there's a vertical stacked enterprise where not just not just cattle, but you could run some chickens in there, and you can do kind of a, Joel Salatin Polyface Farms, where you got that even increases further the land production yield, and then the lack of inputs, the herbicides, the pesticides. Again, you've got ranchers that may be on the fence about this or haven't heard about this yet. Maybe they do. I'm not a rancher. I can't speak to that. But what are the other incentives for those guys? Can they make more money ultimately doing it this way, you think?
Yes. So I talked about, we're really trying to create new opportunities for the producers. We want to connect those disparate ends of the chain. We want consumers to have more transparency and be empowered, and we want ranchers to be elevated in their role in society. The more money thing, if we're kind of acknowledging the place that soil is the solution to our biggest problems, then that really puts the farmer and the rancher as the ambassador to that solution. And so if we're going to address climate change and world hunger and water insecurity and struggling rural economies, and the soil is going to be a piece, if not the total solution to some of those, the farmer has to be empowered to make those changes. And yet for all of human history, they've been in the peasant class. They've been relegated to that peasant class of society. So we want to change that. Premiums are a piece of that. We can get them more money to get paid a higher amount because they provide the transparency, because they have the story, because they have a higher quality product. The challenge that we have with premiums at the commodity level is that they dissipate over time. And so whatever threshold you're differentiating yourself from, as the program scales, that get closer and closer to that threshold. So our goal at Savory Institute is to create new value streams in addition to those premiums. And how we're doing that is we're bringing together a cohort of buyers to buy further back in the supply chain. So right now, if you're a meat snack stick company, you buy from an aggregator like 10 steps in the chain down from the farm. Like most people don't know the farmer and have never been incentivized to know the farmer. We're telling people you should know your farmer and reach further back, but that's a lot of work, because now you got to figure out each of those steps in the supply chain and now develop new relationships with them. So shifting the paradigm on business on that is not a small task. What we're doing to resource that more effectively is we'll bring a meat buyer, a pet food buyer, and a leather buyer, a hide buyer together. All those brands are sourcing from the same suppliers, or want to source from the same suppliers, and they're selling to the same educated consumers. And so they can work together on that supply chain piece and reach further back. The benefits on that for the producer is that most producers pay a disposal fee for their hide and a disposal fee for their organ meats and non-edibles. By bringing those players back to the beginning, they can buy that animal on the hoof from the farmer at a higher rate than what they would get paid selling it on the hoof at like a livestock auction, but at the same time get paid for higher value pieces that they wouldn't get paid for before. So rather than paying $20 to get rid of your hide and $10 to get rid of your offal, now anything you get paid for your hide and your organ meats is $30 plus, just because you were paying to get rid of it, plus whatever the plus side of that is. And so that's something that we're doing right now to resource that whole chain more effectively and bring more value stream onto the farm. We call it whole animal and whole farm utilization. The other one that we think from more of a policy and voluntary market space is We want farmers to get acknowledged for the good work that they do. And so this ecosystem services space is developing markets. So we've probably all heard of carbon credits, that now, you know, someone can create a carbon credit. I planted a forest, somebody does the accounting, there's a protocol to measure it. It goes onto a registry, and then that credit can get transacted to prevent, you know, double counting and, you know, those kinds of things. And then it can get moved around, and people could use that as an offset to their, you know, business practices, or even consumers can say, I want to, you know, offset my shipping on something or whatever. We believe that carbon is a reductionist variable to look at alone. It's a huge important piece to that greenhouse gas discussion and climate change discussion. But if we're going to look at it as a proxy for environmental health and impact, it's the thing that we know the least about. It's the hardest to measure, and it's the most expensive to measure. We know way more about water, way more about organic matter, and even more about biodiversity, which is also hard to measure. And so part of our methodology of kind of looking at that aggregate, it actually helps build a stronger carbon model at the same time. Because what happens in nature is the process of photosynthesis is a plant pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it takes water out of the soil, and it breaks those two compounds apart. It takes the carbon from the carbon dioxide, it takes the water from, or the hydrogen from the water, and it makes a carbohydrate. That's organic matter. What's left over is oxygen, and that goes back into the atmosphere. Those carbon-based structures in the soil, those carbohydrates, they form the smallest compounds in the soil. So they have the most surface area, which means they become this really strong magnetic sponge for water. And so when we have a world that's now getting more dry spells and then more flood events or deluge events, we can start to flatten those curves because the sponge in the soil can hold on to that water for longer. So when a bunch comes, we can soak it up. And when there's long dry spells, we can meter it out because that sponge will hold on to that water for longer. That leads to more biodiversity. So right now, if you want to go measure carbon on your farm, the average size farm, you're looking at about $100,000. Because what happens is that model is so shaky that to get to statistical relevance, they kind of brute force their way through that by taking these huge sample sets. Like, let's make sure we're really sure that there's carbon here. And there's no value prop for that in the marketplace. Nobody can benefit. So farmers aren't being incentivized to do this good work in other arenas. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, actually, because they're all linked in nature, we can look at soil organic matter, we can look at sequestered carbon, and we can look at water together. And we have a more robust carbon model for a cheaper rate, because water's super easy to measure. It's got 150 years of good hydrological science behind it. So that's kind of what we're doing to now bring farmers into what we're calling the ecosystem service credit space. And so companies and governments are realizing they need to be paying attention to carbon, they need to be paying attention to water, they need to be paying attention to biodiversity. Oh, we're actually measuring all three, and they're all interrelated. We're working right now on creating a token or a credit that would be all three bundled, because they exist that way in nature together. So whether a farmer wants to play on a carbon solely platform, our data will be more robust and they can do that, or whether they want to take advantage and actually sell them as a what we call sometimes a molecule, as a unit of ecosystem outcome. That's something that there is definitely a market for. I know that's nerdy and wonky and deep, but brands are having their feet held to the fire. They're being told they have to pay for more of the externalities in their value chain. And so really, for the first time in history, and I know a lot of us, myself included, would like to just kind of step away from that world sometimes and those kind of, big business. But how do we utilize the role that they're in to create good? And so they're being told, you're gonna have to pay for more of that. You're gonna have to pay for those things that used to not end up on your balance sheet. And so if we can provide them solutions, they'll invest in that. And so we want to create a direct link back to the farmers that even if they don't buy the product and do the supply chain work, they can reward farmers for that positive attributes they provide to society. And the other one that's sometimes more tangible for people is the government subsidy side of that. And again, I'm going to stay out of politics. It's well, maybe I won't. That's not really my flavor. I'm not a big government guy. I'm on the more libertarian end of the spectrum. But if governments are going to pay the money that they pay to just produce raw calories, that becomes a pretty big pool that we can start pulling from when you start to look at the other side of their balance sheet of what they pay for floods, fires, and crop insurance, and drought insurance. That's $1 trillion pool around the world that all of a sudden you can start to make the claim that, hey, if we could actually soak that water in upstream in the foothills before it ends up in your valley city, a foot deep, and you've got flood level events, and you've got to pay the billions and billions of dollars to clean that up and get FEMA involved and everybody else, that we could actually soak that in upstream and actually create more production from it. Why would they not go for that? And so there's all sorts of, if we could take 1% of what they spend on emergency recovery and put that into a preemptive mitigation strategy, all of a sudden that's a big pool of money in its own regard. So that we're a global organization. That may not happen in a country as big and convoluted and currently polarized as the US first. But there are countries that are exploring that. New Zealand's pretty high on our list of places that would explore that first, where you would actually pay the farmers for their positive environmental benefits. We get to a world like that, and all of a sudden, the livestock producers are the only ones crushing it year over year on that empirical data. This whole narrative is going to shift on a dime. But that's we've all fought this. A lot of us have fought this good fight for a long time. It's all kind of coming together now, and I actually see, even though there have been some pushings from things like Impossible, I actually see the future is incredibly positive, and things. This is our movement's day in the sun. I really think it's all about to happen here shortly.
Well, I want to be optimistic, and I certainly hope that's the case. One of the things that a little bit frustrates me, if you look at, worldwide, the meat industry, beef industry, multi-trillion-dollar industry, right? In the U.S., as you're, I'm sure, well aware, most of the U.S. beef production is controlled by a handful of companies. There's 4 JBS, there's Tyson, Cargill, and Marfrig. And 2 of those are Brazilian-backed entities. And then we've got the NCBA, which is supposed to represent the interest of the beef industry, which really, I think, from my understanding, is basically a packer interest thing. And I'm just wondering, because you've got this message that I think would resonate with a lot of people, but I see no major advertising campaigns coming out of NCBA or from these big giant meat companies that clearly have the budget to make an impact. We see what's being done by Silicon Valley and Beyond Meat and all the campaign and celebrities and all the money that they're investing in that. But the beef industry, I think they dropped the ball on this. I think there could be so much more they could do to direct that conversation. And maybe it's not in their interest, as we know these big meat companies are now rebranding themselves as protein companies, and some of them are getting behind the Impossible Burger stuff, the Memphis meat stuff, because I think they see it as a more easy profit stream, a revenue stream for them than dealing with farmers and ranchers and cows and rather they can just take some whatever cotton protein and turn it into a protein input and grow it in a lab. Are you also a little frustrated by that, or do you think I'm just imagining things?
No, I think I'm 100% in alignment with you. I think there's a couple forces at play there. I think that if you look at the stakeholders behind those organizations, by definition, ranchers and farmers are not a first mover audience. I won't say that they're not innovative and incredibly intelligent, hardworking, major functional building blocks of society. First movers, though, early adopters, is not usually where they sit. And so when stuff like this emerges and changes, the stakeholders that run and supply and support those institutional bodies, like the ones that you mentioned, they often don't get the support to go and do something, in a head-to-head way. By and large, this movement and having, been a producer myself for the first, 15 years of my career, they really just want this to go away. They're really looking for it to go away. And it's that oligarchy that you mentioned of only having a few buyers. There's such an interesting tension that exists between buyers and sellers. And when I say buyer, I mean the packer, not the end brand or the retailer or the consumer, but the packer. That when you are a producer, you defend the packer at all cost, literally sometimes at all cost, because they are the only ones that buy from you. And so when there's only 2 or 3 or 4 and they're regionalized, there's usually one buyer in town, maybe 2. Good luck pitting them against each other. They're all kind of part of the good old boy in their club, and there's a lot of price control that goes on there that I really think stymies the ability for this whole movement to grow and evolve and get to the next stage. Processing, and I even see some of that discussion about processing in the chat. Processing is a huge part of the bottleneck in this industry. And when you only have one person to sell to, you defend them. I have found that most livestock producers, at least at that cow-calf level, really kind of begrudge the notion of selling this animal that they've stewarded and cared for and used to enhance their landscape into a more industrial, modern feedlot system. But it's the only thing that's out there. So you'll never hear them say that publicly, because most of them don't want to, and the reality is can't become Joel Salatin and Will Harris and Gabe Brown. The nature of where they live and their economies and the nature of those businesses mean you are bolting entire other businesses onto your ranch. And that to me is not the value prop to success. We have to allow ranchers and farmers to focus on the good work that they do. They're already trying to understand all the complexity of nature and living systems. Let's give them the credit for that and let them do that as well as we can possibly do that, and not say, okay, well, to really be effective, you also now have to direct market your product. If you want to, awesome, great. And if that fits your context, awesome and great. Joel Salatin is a mentor of mine. I got the blessing and honor of being able to meet him before he became the famous guru that he is today. And so he took me under his wing, and I ran a place here in Oroville that for close to 10 years, we operated in a way that we had 600 acres of 100-year-old olive trees. We had heirloom stone fruits, heirloom citrus, pears, pomegranates, persimmons. We had fresh picked fruit every day of the year. And then we ran livestock in the orchards. So it was a 2,000-acre farm. We ran livestock in the orchards. The sheep and the cows did the mowing. The goats handled the invasive weeds. The chickens debugged and fertilized. We cut our fuel usage by 85%. And then it was my job to direct market all of that product on our own. And so we cut all the middlemen and aggregators out of it. We had 8 farmers markets a week, sold through a number of CSAs, started urban buying clubs. It's a hard row to hoe. Like it's a lot of effort, and it's not for everybody. We had the benefit of living in California. So much of these movements exists on the coast. If you live in the middle of Wyoming, where do you sell? I mean, 2 ranchers can serve all of Cheyenne all of a sudden. I mean, these are 1,000,000-acre plus ranches. Where do they go? I think we have to consider the middle of the country and kind of start from there outward, and how we consider some of these economic opportunities, economic streams, and kind of what the roles and responsibilities are for these producers.
Let me just, there's a couple things, as far as, what's going to sort of move this forward, maybe legislatively. I mean, there's obviously, there's a bill out there by Representative Massey, Prime Act. There's a 5014 bill pending. I know Wyoming passed a Food Freedom Act, I think, for the state level. I think there's some other legislation being considered.
Hawaii's doing some cool stuff, yeah.
Do you see any of those having a real impact, or there's something else? I mean, this carbon credit, maybe the triple credit that you're talking about. Is there anything that like a voter could possibly do? Because I mean, like I said, I saw a great thing, a meme today that says, voting is 100% more effective than complaining on the internet. So, I mean, what can we as consumers do? I mean, obviously, supporting these guys financially when we can, but are there other things that we can do to sort of advance this?
Yeah, of those that I've dug deep into, the Primact is probably my favorite. What Massey and Pingree have put together there, I think, is spot on. I know Shelley and have engaged with her staff a little bit before. That's Pingree from Maine. And I think her understanding of small rural economies was huge in putting that proposal together. You know, it's died twice. But COVID is changing that. And if there's silver linings that have come out of this, you know, the meat shortage in the stores for retailers, you know, all of a sudden Costco is putting out a, you know, RFP or a cry for help going, you know, we'll work with every small processor in the country, just get us meat. That starts to change things. I think, you know, we as, you know, kind of from a strategist standpoint, looked at what other craft industries had done. And if you look at wine, and you know, wine was the originator of this, to be able to celebrate differences and decommodify. You know, they've just been the leader in this. But then you look at beer and chocolate and coffee, and cannabis is now going that way, as is hemp, to where they're all initially trying to decommodify from the start, or their whole new next evolution. When you look at those movements, they all talked about the growing practices first, and then about 10 years in, they start talking about the processing second. They're bringing craft and authenticity and you know, wholesome values and earnest to the processing side of the equation. Craft meat, if you want to use that term, hasn't got there yet. We're still talking about the growing practices and getting people to understand that. So you know, this notion that a producer could grow an amazing animal and have it harvested at a JBS plant and then still sell it at the farmer's market, no one's been trained to ask those questions, and the farmer doesn't have options provided to them to do anything different. And so until we get more visibility to that, we can't really bring in the voter. The voter doesn't understand why the Primact matters until we have more conversations like this. And so so yes, I absolutely, I'm a big believer in local, more modular supply chains, in creating a rural relevance in an information age economy. And what that looks like is that first stage processing happens in those local communities. Those facilities and that infrastructure is designed in a way that it serves multiple sectors. And so I don't know how deep you guys and your listeners go in on this, but you know, I'm sure Joel probably would have rang the bell on this one a little bit as the town crier. You know, typically a slaughter plant, one, the challenges to become USDA are ridiculous. And then in your HACCP plan, your hazard and critical control point plan, which is kind of your operating plan or your agreement with the federal government, usually wants to limit you to a single species. So if you're in a grass-fed system, whenever your season grows the most and the best grass, which for most places is spring and summer, means is when you have all your clients that want to get their products done. They put the finish on. An animal grows its skeletal structure really first and then kind of fills out muscling second, and then fat comes last. And so if you want to build, you know, marbling and tenderness and even external fat for things like dry aging, you want to have your whole system timed to where that animal is finishing on your best grass, which means that's when the animal needs to be harvested, is right after that. So now you've got this facility that's open for 3 months of the year that's just crushing it. The rest of the year, what are they doing? If you can add in pigs and goats and sheep and other animals into that system, pigs is a really good one because you can feed them on waste products from the farm and other things that aren't as dependent on grass because they're a monogastric omnivore. Their biology is different, that they're not as dependent on that grass cycle. All of a sudden you can level that out and you can build a local plant that can be functional, pay full-time employees. Those full-time employees can create a career and really become craftsmen and better their skill over time. And that facility is going to feed back into the local economy. It removes a logjam and it feeds back at the same time. It puts in long-term roots. That's the kind of world we need. You start adding in, now that plant could have a tannery attached to it and do veg tanning, or get into, you know, what other things could it process? Could it have a communal kitchen that allows, you know, small farms and small brands to create, you know, snack sticks and sausages and other things under their own label? You know, you can get into all sorts of ancillaries from there on. But but regional processing has to be addressed before this thing gets fixed. And we at Savory are looking at how we can pull those levers, but it's going to happen at the policy stage at some point. We're big believers, though, that markets move faster than governments. And one of the things that we're doing to try to help create change on that front is once you have the farmers connected with the brands, the buyers, is that they can form long-term contracts with each other and say, you're going to be my supplier for the next 5 years and produce X amount of volume. When you do that, both sides can forecast. They can remove themselves from the volatility of the general marketplace. But if there's a growth trajectory in that every year you produce 10% more from your producer cooperative, now the processing needs to grow along with that. And so we can build in preferred providers of processing into that contract to where now that processor could use that contract as collateral and go to the bank or private equity or whoever and say, I need to get newer equipment or build out a new wing or add this new ancillary business to meet the needs of this contract over time. And so by creating a more comprehensive collaborative contract, we can start to make changes on that front in the supply chain. But you're spot on. It's a big one, and we've got to address it.
One last thing, Chris, and I appreciate we've taken up an hour of your time, but Ethan Brown, Patrick Brown, I can't remember which one of the two, and I always confuse them. One's an Impossible Burger, one's a Beyond Meat. I think one of them certainly is predicting that we'll see the end of animal agriculture somewhere 2030, 2035. Do you share his optimism, if you want to call it optimism? I tend not to. Do you think animal agriculture is going to be completely off the planet by 2035, or just going to be relegated to a niche for the few weirdos that still want to eat actual meat?
Yeah, I couldn't do what I do without the optimism that people are going to wake up to this. Again, to go back to one of those earlier points I made, that every ecosystem on the planet has plants and animals working together. Why wouldn't we mimic that in our food systems? And so I think we will embody and have to own all of that negative externality from all of those environmental impacts, from raping the land to grow soy and pea, and all of the infrastructure and factory process to turn it into something that looks like meat, something that our bodies crave and want and need. It's a little bit like the ethanol thing. It's kind of like everybody at the core level knows this isn't right. But when you are so deep in that mantra and that echo chamber, it starts to look like a solution. I really believe the vast majority of the vegan movement and the vegetarian movement is a vocal minority, really driven more by welfare than anything else, certainly not by nutrition. And it's a mixture of welfare and environmental impact and climate change. And I think if we can address those two pieces, their argument loses so much value that the vast majority of regular folks want meat in their diet. And I think the data continues to suggest that. They want meat in their diet. They just want to make a conscious choice in that. They certainly don't want to be part of the problem, and they'd love it if they were offered a chance to be part of the solution.
Yeah, wonderful. And I do like that you made that analogy of raping the land, because I can maybe use that and say soy and pea monocrops are rape, instead of hearing the dairy is rape that we hear from the vegans. So maybe we can say soy is rape or something. Anyway, Chris, thank you. Let folks know where they can find you, find out more about the Savory Institute, or anything else you'd like people to know how to get a hold of so they can support you and learn more.
Yeah, so you can go to thesavoryinstitute.org. You can learn more about our network there. You can also learn more about this land to market program. We've got about 30, 40 products in the marketplace now that actually have this seal on them, that have gone here in America, that have gone through USDA labeling. So you can learn more about those products and the companies that are supporting this, both from small companies like a White Oak Pastures or Thousand Hills Graze up in Minnesota, up to big companies like Epic Provisions or Applegate. And then as time goes on, we'll just add to that list of what products are available that people can support, that when you can't buy direct from your farmer, that where you would find those products and be able to have a good snack stick in your pack or in your car or whatever. So yep.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. Enjoy your day and look forward to maybe we'll get you back on down the road because I think we could have gone on for 3 hours, but thanks again for what you do. And again, I speak for the community. We really appreciate the people that are feeding us and the ones that are making a positive impact. If anything, let people know that they're much appreciated because I do agree they are undervalued, underpaid, and underappreciated. And I think we've got to change that. So thank you again.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sean, and thank you for this community and all the great work that you guys are doing.
All
I
right.
really appreciate
Take care,
it.
guys. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.